Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. We're going to do a deep dive into fishing line and how to make the correct choice of line to get the best action out of your baits. Now, I know a lot of people out there understand the differences between your types of fishing line, but within each type, there are different characteristics that can change the impact on your bait, which can ultimately affect your fishing success. Now, I use three types of fishing line. I use a straight fluorocarbon, I use a straight monofilament, and I use a straight braid. Now, there may be some differences within each of those categories, but those are the three things I like. Generally speaking, if I use fluorocarbon, I've got a little bit of stretch, the line sinks. If I've got monofilament, the line generally floats, and it's got a lot of stretch. And then I've got braided line with pretty much zero stretch, generally floats, and that's going to be straight for power fishing. As a whole, though, those aren't necessarily the most important aspects when it goes into increasing the performance of my baits. And this is what we don't hear often talked about. Most of the time when you're talking fishing line, people are like, I go with braid because I don't want stretch and I'm hauling them out of heavy cover, or I go with monofilament because I want stretch. And I do think that those are very important characteristics to know about the line. But more so, if you're talking about getting the best action out of your baits and making the most of your bait and getting the most bites, I think the line choice is oftentimes the biggest hindrance to preventing people from having good days on the water. I think a lot of times people look at the bait, they say, I'm not catching anything, they change baits. I think sometimes they change rod and reels if they're not getting the right presentation out of that bait. But more times than not, I've seen really big impacts on fishing success come from changing the type of line that you're using or the line size that you're using. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So we're going to walk through all of these. Before I do get into that, though, I want to remind you guys that if you like my content, you want more from me, check out my members only page. We do additional videos, we do monthly live streams, you get direct access to me to ask me questions like this, because this is from a viewer. And I figured I'd do a full video on the line. So the main characteristics that I look at when choosing my line size is recognizing the impact that the line has on the bait's performance. So what do I mean by that? First off, you got to look at your sink rate. So generally speaking, if you go higher in line size, you're going to prevent your bait from sinking if you're using braid or monofilament. If you want a faster sink rate, you're better off generally going with a heavier fluorocarbon, because that will actually sink with your bait and help your bait get down. But you also have to recognize that as you go bigger in line diameter, regardless of the type of line that you're using, that will tend to want to slow your bait down. So there is a balance that you want to find between how fast you want your bait to fall. So maybe you're on the water and you're fishing 17-pound monofilament, and your bait, you just feel like you're not getting the right speed of fall out of it. You might want to think about switching to a fluorocarbon or switching to a smaller diameter monofilament, because it does make a really big difference. You'd be surprised to see how much faster a bait can fall with a smaller diameter line, if it's a monofilament or if it's a fluorocarbon, sometimes if it's a heavier fluorocarbon. So you want to be aware of your sink rate, because that's really important. The other end of that spectrum, though, is the line size and the line diameter can actually impact the rise rate. And what I mean by that is, if you throw a bait out 75 feet from the boat and then you go to pull it, you want to envision your line being like at a straight line right at your bait. But generally speaking, it's not. It goes through the water column and then drops down to your bait. So when you pull on your bait, what actually ends up happening is your bait might come more vertical versus coming horizontal or at an angle directly at the boat. This is one of those things that can have a huge impact on your fishing. A lot of times the fish don't want your bait to go vertical, they want it to come horizontal. So if your bait is coming more vertical because the diameter is bigger, at that point you might want to think about going to a smaller line size to get your bait to stay more on the bottom. This happens a lot with springtime fishing, where it seems like you want your bait dragging on the bottom more. And if you're having difficulty feeling the bottom, it's because when you pull your bait, the bait's not actually on the bottom. You're pulling the line and the line's actually pulling your bait up off the bottom. So that's something that you want to keep in mind, that your line not only affects the sink rate of your bait, but it also affects your rise rate while you're working the bait. And in some instances, maybe you want your bait to come more off the bottom. In other instances, maybe you want your bait to stay on the bottom. In other instances, you might want your bait to suspend better. And from those standpoints, you got to figure out what line meets the technique that you're doing to have the most success. Another thing that you got to keep in mind is control. You know, I just had a conversation with a Berkeley designer regarding control and how a bait I was using was actually, I was throwing it on 6-pound test. I was getting amazing action out of the bait, but it was actually hindering me because the line size was so small that the erratic action of the bait was allowing the hooks to hang up on the line. So what I did was I increased to 10 and 12-pound test line. Now these were all fluorocarbons, and it actually like tempered down the movement of that bait to the point where it was not fouling up on itself. That allowed me to effectively fish the bait and generate those strikes and catch the fish, versus with that line that was just too light, it was allowing too much freedom to the bait to the point where it actually was hindering me, because every third or fourth cast I was getting caught on itself. Those are the things that you need to recognize. So a lot of people might put that bait down and say, oh, this thing doesn't run right, it doesn't work right. Well, in reality, I needed to kind of get it under control by moving up a little bit in line size. So that was definitely something that I had to take into account, and I recognized once I made that adjustment, I was effectively fishing it and I was catching a lot more fish because I was able to use the cast. I was able to make an effective cast every time versus having those hooks fouling. Another thing you need to take into account is your feel, right? So depending on what cover you're fishing, you want to either have feel or sometimes not have feel. And what I mean by that is, if you're fishing bottom and you're looking to feel for that sweet little spot of shells, you need to have the feel. So you might want to be throwing specific line that will help you feel the bottom. A lot of times your heavier gauge diameter can transfer more of that feel up into your rod tip where you can tell better, or sometimes you might just need to switch lines as a whole. I personally can't feel much with monofilament. When I switch to a braid, sometimes it's too much sensation. And a fluorocarbon sometimes is a good middle ground. But the point here is, if you're trying to go for feel, you might want to determine that. One of the reasons that people like to fish crankbaits on monofilament is because they take away the feel of that fish biting their bait. They want their rod just to load up with the fish versus feeling that bite of the fish and then pulling the bait away from the fish. If you were to throw a crankbait on braid, a lot of times you don't get the good hookups because you're actually pulling the bait too quickly to set the hook. It's the same thing with topwater. The reason I love to throw monofilament with topwaters is because I see the strike. I don't need to increase my hookup speed at all. I can see the strike. I can tell if the fish has it. And generally speaking, it just allows me to battle that fish without pulling the hooks out of their mouth. So your feel and your stretch kind of go hand in hand. You know, the more stretch you have, the less feel. The less stretch you have, the more feel. But there's times and places where you might want less feel, more stretch, or more feel, less stretch. Ultimately, guys, the line choice that you're making will dictate your success on the water. It is not as simple as saying, I'm going to go out every day and throw a 12-pound test of whatever type of line that it is. There are times you want to increase, there's times you want to decrease, there's times you want to change the type of line that you're using, because you got to find the right performance of each bait. Just because you were throwing one bait on one setup doesn't mean that when you switch baits to a different bait that'll be the right line and rod and reel setup for that same bait that you were having success with before. Just something to take into mind. I can tell you there have been a ton of instances in my boat where two anglers are throwing the exact same thing, really similar rod and reel setup, and then what's determined is one is throwing one type of line or 1 pound test of line and the other's throwing something different. And when you make that switch, it's like boom, both guys are catching them. It's really been proven to me multiple times over. So hopefully this answers the questions that I've been getting on it. If it does and you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new tip video coming out tomorrow.